The day started like any other, though I'd come to expect surprises in my line of work. Still, as a doctor, I was prepared for the unexpected to happen to other people, not me. At 6:15 a.m., my wife Claire stood by the kitchen counter, sipping her morning coffee and scrolling through her phone with a look I couldn't quite read. She was wrapped in her favorite blue robe, looking lost in thought. The early light cast a soft glow on her, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet gratitude that, after nearly 3 decades together, I still woke up next to her every day. We'd been through life's storms and always come out the other side. But lately, Claire's attention was harder to hold on to. I tried to brush it off as the usual busy cycle of life, yet a part of me was bothered by it. "Big day ahead?" I asked casually, pouring my coffee and glancing at the calendar on the fridge. She looked up quickly, as though I'd startled her. "Oh, just the usual," she replied, her voice a little too light. Claire was the director of a small marketing firm, always hustling to keep up with clients. And yet, something about her tone left me uneasy. "Good to know," I said, trying to hide the doubt creeping into my thoughts. In years past, our mornings would have been filled with chatter about the day, plans for the weekend, maybe even a quick update about the kids. But today, as we sat at the table in comfortable silence, I could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. She was here with me, yet somehow her mind was miles away. Claire finished her coffee and checked her watch. "I've got to go," she said, smiling briefly before gathering her things and heading out. I watched her go, that faint feeling of distance lingering as the door clicked shut. I didn't think about it much until a few weeks later, when I noticed another change. She started planning solo trips, weekend retreats, she called them. She'd always loved travel, and I'd tried to encourage her independence. We were a team, after all, and a strong team trusts each other. But now, these trips came up more often than ever before, and each time, she seemed just a little less here. When I casually asked what she was doing on these self-discovery trips, Claire was vague. "Just some meditation classes," she'd say, "or a bit of yoga." I didn't press her, hoping this phase would pass. I assumed she needed the time for herself, time that work and family had often deprived her of. But then came the missed family dinners. It wasn't like Claire to miss time with the kids. She'd make plans, and then at the last minute, I'd find myself setting the table for 3 instead of 4. Something came up, she'd text, her words brief and hurried. And when I asked her about it, she'd smile and assure me that it was just work. That was the first moment the doubt really crept in. It was subtle, a little tickle in the back of my mind, but it was there. Still, I pushed it aside. Every relationship has its rough patches, I told myself, and surely, after all these years, she would talk to me if something was wrong. But something felt off, and the feeling was only growing. Then one evening, I found myself alone at home, the kids out with friends, and Claire once again away for a weekend retreat. I sat on the couch with a book, but I wasn't reading. I kept glancing at the clock, telling myself she'd text or call any minute to check in. After a while, I decided to tidy up, hoping the distraction would quiet my mind. I straightened the pillows, picked up her magazine, and that's when I noticed her phone. It lay on the table beside the couch, vibrating softly with a new message notification. She'd left it behind. The screen lit up briefly, and I caught the sender's name. Just a single letter, D. Before I could think about what I was doing, I picked up the phone, my heart pounding. I hesitated. Was this curiosity? Or was it something darker? The message preview read simply, "Can't wait to see you," and then the rest cut off. That was all, just a few words, but they sank into me like a stone. I set the phone back down, trying to steady myself. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying that message over and over in my mind. Who was D? A friend? A colleague? Or was this the hint of something else? The next morning, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. I reminded myself that marriages go through phases, that sometimes things simply don't make sense right away. But as much as I wanted to believe this, the memory of that message wouldn't leave me alone. I went about my day as usual, moving between patient rooms and balancing administrative tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to Claire. I'd always known her as open and honest, sometimes to a fault. So why? I wondered. Would she suddenly become so secretive? After work, I stopped by the grocery store to pick up a few things for dinner. While pushing my cart down the aisle, I decided to call her. She answered quickly, but her voice sounded distant, almost distracted. "Oh, hi, sweetheart," she said, sounding surprised. "What's up?" "Just grabbing a few things for dinner. Thought I'd check in and see if you needed anything," I replied, trying to sound casual. There was a slight pause before she responded. "No, I'm good. Thanks for asking. I'll probably be home a bit late, though. A client call ran long, and I still have some work to wrap up." "All right, no problem. Drive safe," I said, hanging up with an uneasy feeling settling in. She hadn't asked what I was making for dinner, something she normally would have done. It was a small detail, but one that didn't sit right with me. That weekend, Claire was scheduled to leave for another retreat. She packed her bag the night before, a small rolling suitcase she usually reserved for business trips. I watched her carefully as she moved around the room, wondering if she'd mention anything about the location or the schedule. But she didn't offer much, just that it would be a pretty busy weekend with meditation and workshops. As she zipped up her suitcase, I said casually, "Mind if I join you for one of these sometime? Might be good for both of us." She paused, her hands freezing on the zipper. For a split second, something flickered across her face, a look I couldn't quite read. But she recovered quickly, smiling as she turned to me. "Oh, you'd hate it," she said, laughing lightly. "Hours of silent meditation and group discussions. Not exactly your style." "Maybe," I replied, trying to sound amused. "But I'd like to see what's been helping you so much. Seems like these retreats have really become important to you." "They have," she agreed, her tone a little too quick. "It's good to get away now and then, clear my mind." When Claire left the next morning, I watched her drive down the street until her car disappeared around the corner. Normally, I would have shrugged it off, trusted her to be exactly where she said she'd be. But the seed of doubt had taken root, and I couldn't shake it. An hour later, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. I felt ridiculous even considering it, but curiosity and a strange urge to protect myself pushed me forward. I searched for the wellness retreat center she'd mentioned a few months ago, the one where she'd supposedly attended these meditation weekends. To my surprise, it wasn't listed online anywhere. I tried searching for other similar centers nearby, but came up empty. Maybe it was just a small place, I thought. Not everything has an online footprint. But the absence of information felt odd, given that Claire's line of work relied heavily on internet presence and digital marketing. Why would she keep going to a place that couldn't even be found on the web? Just as I was about to close the search, a thought struck me. What if her trips weren't about wellness retreats at all? Over the next few days, I kept my observations to myself, carefully watching for any signs that might explain her recent behavior. I tried to act normal. Even when she returned home late the following Sunday night, her usual cheery self, carrying a small paper bag filled with herbal teas and essential oils she'd picked up at the retreat. She hugged me, seeming genuinely happy to be home, but I noticed something odd. Her scent was different. She usually wore the same floral perfume I'd given her for our anniversary last year. But tonight, I caught a faint whiff of something spicier, almost like a cologne I didn't recognize. I thought about asking her about it, but the words felt awkward on my tongue. We sat down to dinner, and Claire talked about the retreat, how she'd practiced new meditation techniques, how she'd met a fantastic group of women who were just as eager to unwind and relax. Her words were enthusiastic, but her gaze kept shifting as she spoke, and she seemed overly focused on the details, describing every moment with precise detail, almost as if she were rehearsing a script. By the time she finished, my curiosity had shifted into something sharper. I knew Claire well enough to know when she was hiding something. But what? I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more proof. After she went to bed, I found myself scrolling through our shared bank account. My pulse quickened when I saw a recent charge from a luxury hotel in a city over 3 hours away, one we hadn't visited together in years. I stared at the transaction, the date lining up perfectly with her last retreat. I felt my stomach tighten, the reality settling in. Claire had never mentioned a change in location, Yet there it was, a hotel charge, staring back at me like a glaring clue in a mystery novel. For the first time, I began to wonder if I'd been fooling myself all along. I spent the next few days trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that had settled in my chest. I'd always believed trust was the foundation of our marriage. But now, every glance, every conversation with Claire felt like it had an undertone, an unseen layer just out of reach. I kept telling myself I needed more than a hotel charge and a text message preview. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she had just decided to splurge, or maybe the D in the message was a colleague or a friend she hadn't thought to mention. But in my heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, undeniably wrong. It wasn't until the following week that another piece of the puzzle fell into place. One night, as we sat down for dinner, I noticed Claire's phone on the table beside her. She seemed oddly aware of it, glancing down at the screen every few minutes. When it buzzed softly, she quickly picked it up, glanced at the message, and then placed it face down, brushing her hair back and looking up at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Busy night?" I asked, hoping to sound casual. "Oh, it's just work," she replied lightly. "You know how it is, clients are never off the clock." I nodded, but something about her response didn't sit right. For years, she'd been meticulous about boundaries, especially in the evenings. She always believed that family time was sacred and discouraged after-hours communication. Now, she was acting as though these late-night messages were just part of her routine. After dinner, she excused herself, saying she needed to finish a few emails before bed. I cleared the dishes, watching her retreat to her office, the door clicking shut behind her. As I gathered the plates, a memory surfaced from a few weeks earlier. Another night, another excuse about late client work. That was the same night I'd found her phone left behind, the message from D still fresh in my mind. The next day, my doubts grew heavier. I began noticing other things, small details that added to the pattern forming in my mind. Claire had started using a new skincare line, something high-end I hadn't seen before. When I commented on it, she shrugged it off, saying a friend had recommended it. Yet, she was secretive, almost defensive, about where she'd bought it, a reaction that seemed disproportionate to something as small as moisturizer. But then came the final straw. 2 weeks later, Claire announced she'd be going on another weekend retreat. She called it a mindfulness getaway, a weekend of rest and relaxation. It sounded like the same story she'd told before, yet this time, there was a different tone in her voice, a forced lightness that set my nerves on edge. I watched her pack, my eyes catching on a small black bag she was folding into her suitcase. It wasn't the usual one she'd take to these retreats. This bag was much newer, and in it, I caught a flash of a dress I didn't recognize, a deep burgundy color that seemed out of place for the kind of casual yoga trips she'd been describing. Before she left, I hugged her tightly, more out of instinct than anything else. She pulled away too quickly, giving me a peck on the cheek before rushing out the door. I stood in the entryway, watching as her car backed out of the driveway. The doubt, the suspicion that had been simmering inside me, felt almost unbearable. As soon as she was gone, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do before. I pulled out her last bank statement from our shared filing cabinet, scanning through the charges. Most of it was routine, groceries, gas, the usual household expenses. But then I found it, a payment to a high-end jewelry store dated 3 days after her last retreat. It wasn't just a small splurge either. This was a significant amount, and it stood out like a glaring warning. Claire had never mentioned any jewelry, no gifts, no new piece of family heirloom that would justify this cost. I felt my throat tighten as I stared at the transaction, knowing in my gut that this was something she hadn't planned for me to find. Fighting the sick feeling building inside me, I took a breath and dialed the store's number. When a representative answered, I explained that I had questions about a recent purchase on my wife's account. The woman on the other end was polite, but her words struck me like a hammer. "Oh yes, I remember Mrs. Harmon," she said. "She came in looking for something special. A bracelet, I believe. A gift for someone." The blood drained from my face. She hadn't bought it for me. My mind raced, thoughts colliding as I tried to make sense of it all. Claire, my wife of nearly 30 years, was buying gifts, slipping away on secret weekends, lying about work, and doing it all right under my nose. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, replaying every interaction with her over the past few months, trying to spot the warning signs I'd missed. The shifts in her schedule, the unexplained purchases, the sudden trips that seemed so harmless at first. But now, each piece fit too perfectly into the picture I'd been dreading. It wasn't until late that night, as I lay awake in our darkened bedroom, that I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. This was no longer about vague suspicions or doubts. I had proof, tangible evidence that Claire was hiding something that she clearly didn't want me to know. And now, it was up to me to find out exactly how deep her deception went. That weekend was the longest I'd endured in years. I spent it alone in the house, the silence pressing down on me as I tried to keep my mind from spinning out of control. Claire texted a few times, short, simple messages letting me know she'd arrived safely and was enjoying the retreat. But each word felt like a thorn, twisting with the knowledge of what I'd discovered. The bracelet, her unexplained client work, the hotel receipts, and of course, the message from Dee. Every time I tried to piece together a rational explanation, something didn't add up. I went through the motions, pretending to have a normal weekend, but the truth was, my mind was a storm of questions. Who was she with? How long had this been going on? And why had I only started to see it now, after years of trusting her? On Sunday evening, Claire came home looking radiant. She was wearing the burgundy dress I'd seen in her bag, her hair done in loose waves, with just a hint of makeup, more than I was used to seeing her wear. As she walked through the door, she seemed surprised to see me standing there. "You look different," I said, struggling to keep my tone even. "Oh, thank you," she replied, a little flustered as she dropped her bag by the door. The retreat was just amazing. They really emphasized self-care and wellness. It was nice to get away from everything and focus on myself for a change. She brushed past me, heading toward the bedroom to unpack. I watched her go, my mind racing. She was selling this story so smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if she'd rehearsed it. When she returned, I noticed her watch was gone, replaced by a thin, elegant bracelet, a new one, something I'd never seen before. The sight of it made my chest tighten, but I forced a smile. "Nice bracelet," I commented. "Is it new?" She looked down, her fingers brushing over it. "Oh yes, just a little something I picked up for myself," she replied a little too casually. I thought I deserved a treat. I nodded, feeling the heat rise in my face as I resisted the urge to press further. If it was the same bracelet she'd bought at the jewelry store, she'd gone to impressive lengths to cover her tracks. After she'd gone to bed, I made my way to her office, my heart pounding as I carefully opened the drawer where she kept her laptop. Normally, I would never have invaded her privacy like this. But I needed answers, and I couldn't wait any longer. I turned on the computer, searching for anything that might point me to the truth. She'd always been cautious about privacy, but even the best habits slip. It didn't take long before I found a recent email thread titled, Weekend Itinerary. I clicked it open, hoping to find details of her retreat. Instead, the message trail led me to something completely unexpected. A reservation confirmation for a suite at the very same luxury hotel I'd seen on her bank statement. I leaned back in her chair, a bitter taste rising in my throat as I stared at the screen. She hadn't been on a wellness retreat. She'd been in a hotel room, and not alone. There was no mistaking it now. The reality was as clear as the words on the screen. My wife, the woman I had trusted for decades, had been lying to me. The rest of the week passed in a surreal blur. Claire carried on as usual, going to work, coming home, and acting as though nothing had changed. She was cheerful, even affectionate, but her every move felt calculated, as if she were performing a role she'd carefully rehearsed. I decided that confronting her without more evidence would only backfire. She'd deny it, make up excuses, and twist the truth into something I couldn't unravel. I needed something undeniable, something she couldn't dismiss as mere suspicion. After work one evening, I made a decision. I called a private investigator, a retired detective named Bill, who came highly recommended. The moment he picked up, I felt a sense of control return to me, as if finally I could take action, make sense of this mess. "Bill, I need help," I said, my voice steady but tense. I believe my wife's been lying to me, and I need to know the truth. The next few weeks were torturous. Bill's updates were sparse, and every day felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, I had to sit across from Claire at the dinner table, knowing she was hiding something from me, yet acting as if everything was fine. I forced myself to remain calm, my suspicions buried beneath a mask of casual conversation. If she sensed anything, she didn't show it. Then one Friday afternoon, Bill called. His voice was grim as he delivered the news I'd both feared and expected. I have the proof you need, he said. Clara's been meeting a man regularly, someone who signs into the hotel as D. Martin. I have photos, timestamps, even a video. There's no doubt about it. The air felt heavy around me, my chest tight as I struggled to absorb his words. The images he described were burned into my mind before I even saw them. A private rendezvous, hushed conversations, shared laughter. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined. That evening, I sat alone in my office, Bill's report spread out on the desk in front of me. There was Claire, her face relaxed and carefree as she strolled beside a man I didn't recognize. They looked comfortable together, intimate in a way that left no room for doubt. Every picture felt like a punch to the gut, each one a stark reminder of the life she'd been hiding from me. For hours, I stared at the images, my mind racing with questions. How had she done this for so long? Why hadn't I seen it sooner? And most of all, what was I supposed to do now? As I sat there, the answers started to crystallize in my mind. Confronting her wasn't enough. I needed a plan, something that would ensure she couldn't talk her way out of this. If she'd spent months, maybe years, lying to my face, then I had to be prepared. In that moment, I made a decision. I would wait, gathering every piece of information I could until I was certain that I had all the leverage. Only then would I let her know that her charade was over. But this time it would be on my terms. The days following Bill's call were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. Every conversation with Claire, every glance across the breakfast table, felt like I was acting in a play where only I knew the script. I had to keep my face neutral, my words casual, as though nothing had changed, even though everything had. I needed her to believe that I was still in the dark until I had everything in place. That night, I called Bill back, asking him to continue his surveillance. I needed a clearer picture of the life she was living behind my back. He agreed, his tone somber, and assured me he'd follow up with more details by the end of the week. Over the next few days, Claire's behavior became more brazen. She'd slip out for work dinners that stretched late into the night, barely offering an explanation. When she returned, she would move around the house with a distracted air, her mind clearly elsewhere. And then there were her phone calls, more frequent than ever and always hushed. I found myself analyzing every little movement, every smile she flashed as she checked her messages, each one feeling like a small betrayal. One night, as she lay asleep beside me, her phone vibrated on her nightstand. My stomach tightened as I watched the screen light up, a new message notification flashing briefly before going dark. I reached over cautiously, my fingers hovering above the phone. I hesitated, feeling an instinctive resistance to invading her privacy. But that hesitation quickly faded. I'd lost the luxury of trust. The message was from D, just as I'd suspected. I tapped it open, my pulse racing as I read. Can't stop thinking about you. Friday can't come soon enough. The words hit me harder than I'd anticipated, each one a dagger twisting in my chest. I placed the phone back on the table, careful to leave it exactly as I'd found it, and lay back in bed, my mind racing. She was planning another weekend with him, and this time, I would be ready. When Friday came, I made sure to leave the house before Claire, letting her assume I had a busy day at work. But I had already planned my day carefully. I'd taken the day off, clearing my schedule, and waited down the street where I could see our driveway without being seen. I watched as Claire emerged, dressed impeccably in a fitted black dress and heels I'd never seen before. She was more than ready for the rendezvous she had planned, and as I watched her pull away, my heart twisted with a mix of anger and betrayal. I waited a few moments, then followed her at a safe distance. The drive took us out of town, heading toward the city center. As we neared the same luxury hotel I'd seen on her bank statement, I felt a sick sense of confirmation settle over me. She pulled into the hotel parking lot, oblivious to my car a few lengths behind, and stepped out, checking her reflection in the car window before heading inside. For a few minutes, I just sat there, watching her walk through the hotel doors without a single hesitation. In that moment, I knew I had to see it with my own eyes. Inside, I found a spot near the lobby's coffee bar, close enough to watch her without drawing attention. She paced by the elevator, checking her phone, looking as though she was waiting for someone. And then he appeared, a man, maybe 10 years younger than me, tall and sharply dressed. He greeted her with a familiar smile, his hand resting lightly on her arm as they walked together toward the elevators. The reality was undeniable. They shared an ease, an intimacy that went beyond friendship or business. As I watched them disappear behind the elevator doors, a cold resolve settled over me. There would be no coming back from this. I returned to my car, sitting in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel as I took deep breaths to steady myself. The anger I felt was eclipsed only by a sense of purpose. Now that I knew the full extent of her betrayal, I could take control of the situation on my terms. Back at home, I reviewed everything Bill had gathered: photos, hotel bills, emails that left no room for doubt. I compiled everything into a folder, a meticulous record of the lies she'd been telling. The evidence was overwhelming, and with each piece I added, my sense of betrayal deepened. But I forced myself to remain calm. This wasn't just about anger. This was about ensuring that when I confronted her, she would have nowhere to turn, no way to twist the truth. As I finished, a new thought crossed my mind. Our finances were closely linked, and her actions could affect not only me, but also the life I'd built for myself and my children. I spent the evening reviewing our accounts, double-checking that everything important was under my control. I withdrew from our shared investments, moved my assets to a separate account, and made sure that my legal preparations were solid. The confrontation, I knew, had to be carefully planned. Claire was intelligent and persuasive, able to twist things if given the chance. If I let emotion cloud my actions, I'd be giving her exactly the opening she needed. Instead, I decided to wait until she was back from her retreat, setting the stage for a confrontation that would be undeniable, final. I rehearsed what I would say, keeping my tone measured, factual. There would be no yelling, no accusations, just a presentation of the truth that she could not deny. I imagined the shock on her face, the realization dawning as her world unraveled around her. That Sunday, I stayed calm as she walked through the door, cheerfully greeting me as though nothing had happened. She set down her bag, her smile confident, and for a moment, I wondered if she had any idea what was coming. But I pushed the thought aside, knowing that soon enough she would. That night, as she brushed her hair and prepared for bed, I sat down beside her, my heart steady as I looked into her eyes. For the first time in months, I felt completely calm, as if everything I'd endured had led to this exact moment. "Claire," I said quietly, my voice low but unwavering, "I need to talk to you." She looked up, her expression softening, as if sensing that something serious was coming. "Yes," she replied, trying to sound casual, but I caught the slight tension in her tone. I took a breath, steadying myself. "I know about you and Dee," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I know everything." Her smile faded instantly, replaced by a look of shock and something else, fear. She stared at me, her mouth opening as though she were about to speak. But for once, words seemed to fail her. As she sat there, frozen, I could see the truth sink in. Her secrets were out, and there was no escape. The silence between us stretched unbearably, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Claire's face had gone pale, her eyes wide as she absorbed my words. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, make some excuse, try to spin the truth as she'd done so many times before. But the calm in my voice, the finality of "I know everything," seemed to strip her of that option. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice trembling as she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I reached for the folder beside me, the collection of evidence I'd assembled, and placed it on the bed between us. The truth sat there, as cold and irrefutable as stone. Without a word, I opened it, pulling out the photos from Bill, the images of her and Dee at the hotel, the confirmation emails, and the hotel bills. Claire's face crumpled as she looked down, each piece of evidence an undeniable mark of her betrayal. Her hands began to shake as she lifted one of the photos, a snapshot of her walking with Dee in the hotel lobby. Her arm looped through his. "Why?" I asked, my voice steady, though the hurt cut deep. "Why did you feel the need to hide this from me? And after all these years?" She took a deep breath, setting the photo back down, her gaze locked on her lap. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want this to happen. It just did." I shook my head, struggling to keep my composure. "You didn't want to hurt me? Claire, you've lied to my face, hidden things from me, and taken our life together and thrown it away, all without even the courtesy of telling me the truth." "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking as she finally met my gaze, her eyes filling with tears. "I never meant for it to go this far. I felt so lost, so disconnected. I didn't know how to talk to you. So I looked for something else, something that made me feel alive." "Alive?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You looked for someone else because you were disconnected? Claire, we built this life together. We raised a family, shared everything. And instead of coming to me, you turned to him?" She opened her mouth, struggling for words. "I didn't think you'd understand," she finally said, her voice wavering. "You're so focused on work, on your patients, on everything outside of us." I felt like I didn't matter anymore. Her words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. I wouldn't let her twist this into some attempt to make herself the victim. "So, instead of speaking to me, you decided to lie, to hide this affair. And you expect me to believe it's because I wasn't paying attention?" She looked down, the silence between us thick with tension. After a long pause, she finally said, "I was going to end it. I knew it couldn't last. I just didn't know how to stop. I'm sorry, truly sorry." "You say that now, but for months you've lived this lie. Right here under our roof," I replied coldly. "So tell me, was any of this worth it? Do you even understand the damage you've done?" Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at me, a pleading expression on her face. "Please, I know I've made a terrible mistake. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if there's any chance, I want to try to make it right." I shook my head, letting out a slow, measured breath. "You had months to make it right, Claire. But instead, you went back to him, again and again, even when you knew you were lying to me. And now, after all that, you want me to believe this apology." She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away, standing and crossing the room. My mind was racing, replaying her words, the years we'd spent together, every shared memory now tainted with the knowledge of her betrayal. "I want us to go to therapy," she said suddenly, her voice thick with desperation. "Couples counseling, anything, just to try and fix this." I turned, narrowing my eyes. "Counseling now? After I caught you? Claire, do you really think that a few sessions with a therapist will erase the fact that you deceived me, lied to me, and betrayed our entire marriage?" "I know it's not enough," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I can't bear to lose everything we've built. I don't want to throw it all away. I love you." The words stung, even though I knew they were hollow. She claimed to love me, yet she'd spent months tearing our life apart in secret. The contradictions, the lies, and the deceit, it was all too much. I walked to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Claire," I said, my voice low and steady, "you made your choice long before I found out. You chose him, over and over, and now you're trying to convince me to forgive you when it's convenient." "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she reached for me. "I'll do anything. Just give me a chance." But her words meant nothing now. I'd made up my mind long before tonight. The moment I'd seen her and Dee together, smiling, laughing, as though the life we'd built meant nothing. There was no going back, not now. "I'll talk to my lawyer in the morning," I said quietly, the finality of the words settling over me like a cold weight. "You'll hear from them soon." The shock in her eyes was unmistakable, but I felt nothing as I turned away, closing the door softly behind me. The life we'd shared, the marriage we'd once cherished, all of it had been shattered, left behind as a hollow reminder of a truth that no longer mattered. I walked down the hallway, my steps echoing in the silence, each one a reminder that from this moment on, I was truly, finally free. The next morning, the house was filled with an uncomfortable silence. I woke early, partly out of habit and partly to avoid seeing Claire. Her pleading face, her words from the night before, kept flashing in my mind. I knew she was probably waiting for me in the kitchen, hoping for a change of heart. But there would be none. By the time I dressed and gathered my things, she was standing by the kitchen counter, clutching her coffee mug like a lifeline. Her eyes were swollen, red from the tears I knew she'd shed after I left the room. She looked at me, her expression raw, searching for some hint of forgiveness. But I'd already moved beyond that. "I'm heading out early today," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "There's nothing left to discuss." "Please," she whispered, stepping toward me, her voice desperate. "Don't do this. I know I've ruined everything, but I don't want to lose us. I can change. I can be better. For you, for us." The words felt empty, hollow promises she'd crafted in her mind to salvage what little control she still thought she had. I looked away, forcing myself to keep my resolve steady. "I'll be staying somewhere else for a while," I replied, sidestepping her outstretched hand. "You'll receive the divorce papers soon. The sooner we handle this, the better it will be for both of us." She was silent, and as I turned to leave, I could feel the weight of her regret, her realization that this was final. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The door clicked shut behind me, and as I walked to my car, I felt a strange sense of relief, a cold clarity that came with the end of deception. At the office, I buried myself in work, focusing on patients, paperwork, and anything that could keep my mind off the events of the night before. My colleagues noticed my silence, but I brushed off their concern, telling them I was just tired, that it had been a long week. During my lunch break, I called my lawyer, outlining the specifics I wanted in the divorce proceedings. We discussed property division, financial protections, and how to ensure the stability of my assets. Claire and I had shared a life, but now everything needed to be dismantled, and I needed to make sure she couldn't further damage what I had built. I had the divorce papers drafted, leaving nothing to chance. They were firm, granting her little access to my investments and joint accounts, ensuring that any attempt to drag this out would lead only to more loss on her side. If she wanted this separation, she would feel the weight of her actions. Over the next week, I found an apartment in the city, a modest place that suited my needs. It was strange, after so many years of shared space, to be living alone. But the quiet, the simplicity of having a place free from lies and betrayal, brought me a comfort I hadn't felt in years. I filled the shelves with books, hung a few framed photographs of family, and took up running in the mornings, using the brisk air to clear my mind. Claire called several times, each call left unanswered. Her messages became more desperate, pleading with me to reconsider, to talk things through, as if we were dealing with a simple misunderstanding. I deleted each message, knowing that hearing her voice would only stir up the pain I was trying to leave behind. One evening, as I was unpacking a box of old family photos, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from our daughter, Anna, who had sensed something was wrong but hadn't known the full story. I realized that I would have to tell her and our son, Ben, about the divorce soon, that they would need to know why their lives were about to change. After some thought, I called them, asking if they'd meet me for dinner at a small Italian restaurant we used to frequent as a family. It was a place filled with happy memories, a neutral setting where I could tell them the truth without the walls closing in. When we met, their faces were filled with concern. Anna, who had always been perceptive, looked at me closely, her brow furrowing as she noticed the weight I carried. Ben, younger and more guarded, remained silent, his eyes flickering between Anna and me. After we ordered, I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Your mother and I were separating. We're going to get a divorce." Anna's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling up as she processed the news. Ben, too, was visibly shaken, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the words. They asked questions, their voices layered with shock, pain, and confusion. I tried to answer as honestly as I could without burdening them with details, telling them that our relationship had changed, that the trust we'd built had been broken. Anna's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her hand reaching for mine. Dad, I'm so sorry. I knew something was off. I just didn't know it was this bad. Ben's voice was quieter, hurt flickering in his gaze. How long have you known? A few months, I said, my voice steady. It wasn't easy to accept, but sometimes the truth leaves you no choice. And I had to make a choice that would be best for all of us. They took it hard, but they both agreed to stay with me, at least until things settled. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the full extent of their mother's betrayal. Not yet. But I could see in their eyes that they understood, that they would stand by me through the storm. In the weeks that followed, I felt a strange sense of calm. Life was no longer wrapped in deception, no longer plagued by the weight of secrets. Claire's attempts at reconciliation dwindled. She'd finally realized that there was no undoing what she had done. I finalized the divorce terms, handing her as little as legally possible, securing my assets and protecting the life I had left. For the first time in years, I felt the freedom to plan my life without the weight of someone else's lies. I threw myself into work, took on new cases, began volunteering at a community health center, and started mentoring medical students. The quiet strength of my new routine helped to rebuild what her betrayal had tried to destroy. One night, after a particularly long shift, I sat on the couch in my apartment, looking around at the simple space I'd built. The divorce papers were signed, the assets secured, and the past left behind. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully exhale, to let go of the anger, the bitterness, and the sadness that had filled me. I wasn't the same man I had been before Claire's betrayal. But maybe that was all right. Maybe, in the end, I had found something stronger, something truer within myself. As I sat there, I felt a new sense of purpose. My life was mine again, and while the road had been painful, it had led me here, to a place where I could finally rebuild, where I could finally start over. The weight was gone, and in its place, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. Several weeks passed, and the divorce was finalized. The weight of betrayal had lifted, replaced by a strange clarity. I hadn't fully realized how deeply Claire's deceit had affected me until I was finally free of it. My routine was mine again, untouched by lies, and each day brought a sense of quiet accomplishment. One evening, as I was leaving the hospital, I spotted Claire waiting by my car. She looked nervous, clutching a folder in her hands. I hadn't seen her since the divorce was finalized, and the sight of her stirred up a complex mix of emotions. Memories of love, betrayal, and the life we'd once shared. "Mark," she began, her voice hesitant, "I wanted to give you this." She held out the folder, her eyes shadowed with something that almost looked like regret. I took it, unsure of what to say. She looked away, her gaze lingering on the quiet parking lot. "Why now?" I asked, not unkindly. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to understand. I lost my way. I know that sounds hollow, but it's the truth. I'm sorry, Mark, for everything." I looked down at the folder, her apology echoing in my mind. I realized in that moment that I no longer needed answers. The pain was behind me, replaced by a resolve to live honestly, with or without explanations from her. "Goodbye, Claire," I said quietly, feeling the finality of the words. She nodded, her face softening, and walked away. I watched her go, sensing this was the last chapter of a story I was finally ready to close. The following weekend, I had dinner with Anna and Ben. Since the divorce, they'd stayed close, even more supportive than I could have asked. That night, as we sat around a table in my apartment, laughing over a story Anna shared, I felt an ease I hadn't experienced in years. Ben raised his glass, looking at me with a pride that warmed my heart. "To Dad," he said, "for teaching us what it means to stand up for yourself and live with integrity." We clinked glasses, the moment simple but meaningful. I realized that, in the end, I hadn't lost my family. I'd gained something far more valuable, their respect, and a bond built on honesty and resilience. A few weeks later, I was walking through the park, enjoying the cool evening air, when I crossed paths with Sarah, a nurse from the hospital. She greeted me with a warm smile, her face familiar and comforting. We'd shared a few conversations over the years, but we'd always been too busy to really connect. "Mark, nice to see you here," she said, falling in a step beside me. "Likewise," I replied, smiling. "I didn't know you were into evening walks." She laughed, a sound that was genuine, unguarded. "It's my way of unwinding after a long shift. And I could say the same about you." We fell into a comfortable rhythm, talking about work, our favorite books, and our shared passion for helping others. It felt natural, easy, and for the first time I allowed myself to consider the possibility of opening up to someone new. As we reached the end of the path, she turned to me, her expression kind and curious. "Maybe we could grab coffee sometime?" I nodded, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "I'd like that." We exchanged numbers, and as she walked away, I felt a cautious sense of hope. My life, once fractured, had begun to heal. The journey had been painful, but it had led me here, to a place where I could rebuild, where I could allow new connections to grow. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment, and looked out over the quiet park, the city lights twinkling in the distance. It was a simple scene, but it was mine, a life no longer defined by deception, but by the quiet strength I'd found in starting over. And with that, I took my first steps toward a new beginning.